helping our postgraduate students who have this international business and international finance as part of their curriculum. So without much delay, we will officially start the proceeding. We will be first presenting our first slide, and then it will be followed by our prayer. Then there will be a formal words of welcome. So first we will present, and then we will join the proceedings.
Asato ma sadgamaya Tamaso ma jyotirgamaya Mrityo ma amritam gamaya Om Shanti 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 Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.
Once again, I request Mansoor Siddiqui Saab, who is presenting now, to please stop presentation. Otherwise, it will be difficult for the participants to view the resource person. Mansoor Siddiqui Saab, please. Now, for the official words of welcome, it will be Parvati Mohan from the Department of Commerce of Beselis College. Over to you, Parvati Miss.
Good evening, one and all. Myself, Parvati Mohan, Assistant Professor in the Department of Commerce, Beselis College, Kottayam. Department of Commerce, in association with IQ, on the topic International Business, Finance and Monetary System and Overview. So I think during this pandemic era, this the entire economic system has tremendously transformed in its various sectors. I think this issue is very relevant now, and we are glad to have a very eminent personality today to deliver a talk on this particular subject, who is none other than Javed Ali sir. Mr. Javed Ali is an audit and finance professional with more than 4 decades of cross-cultural experiences in managing audit, accounts, and financial operations. He is presently working as Chief Internal Auditor with Saudi Maintenance Company Limited, Riyadh. He is also delivering lectures on audit, finance, soft skills, attitudinal development and motivation to students of renowned universities or institutions of India in the light of his vast experience in the corporate world. So on behalf of the Postgraduate Department of Commerce and IQAC of Beselis College, I welcome you, sir, to this webinar session. Next, I would like to welcome our principal, of course. In his absence too, I would like to mention his name because he is there for each and every endeavors in our college. So I welcome you, sir, Dr. Biju Thomas, to this webinar session. And for formality's sake, I would like to welcome each and every faculty members of our department. Then I also would like to welcome each and every participants of this webinar, which includes research scholars, teachers from other colleges, faculty members, students, etc. So I welcome you all to this gathering. Once again, I welcome you, Javed Ali sir, to this webinar session. The screen is now yours. Thank you.
Javed Ali sir, your mic is actually mute. Your mic is mute, sir. Would you switch it on? Switch the microphone on. Okay, for participants,
Is it okay now? Am I audible?
yes, sir. Yes, sir. Very much. Very much.
Okay.
Participants, kind attention. Please switch your mic as well as video off throughout the presentation. Later, at the time of discussion, you may switch it on, or you may raise your questions through chat. We will let sir know the details. Especially this being an evening, the internet traffic is likely to be very heavy. So kindly adhere to the instructions. Thank you. Over to you, sir, to continue. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Parvati, for a nice introduction. Let me start. Respected Principal, Basilisk College, Head of the Department of Commerce, all faculty and webinar organizing team committee members, students, and other participants. A very good evening to you all. It's a great pleasure for me to speak as a resource person in this webinar arranged by your college. I'll be discussing about 8-9 agenda points relating to the international business, finance, and monetary system. So let's begin first. What is the meaning of international finance? International finance simply refers to any financial transaction that takes place across national borders. If money leaves one country and arrives in another, for whatever reason, the transaction falls under the international finance. International finance is a monetary transaction that occurs between two or more countries. This sounds simple enough, but in reality, transacting across national borders raises issues of currencies, exchange rates, and the exploitation of developing economies. Exchange rates and the exploitation of international finance is a way to analyze the economic status of the countries you may wish to do business with, judge the foreign markets, compare inflation rates, and pay bills in a foreign currency. Without international finance, you would not be able to compare currency exchange to figure out the cost of doing business abroad. Now the question is, why do we have international finance? In a nutshell, we have international finance because we live in an era of globalization. Businesses buy and sell goods abroad. Countries often borrow money from each other, and organizations increasingly operate on an international scale. An international system of finance helps to keep the peace between nations in this globalized world. Without a system of regulating cross-border financial transactions, each nation would act in its own self-interest. Much of the economics underpinning international finance is concerned with keeping the flow of money in a disciplined state. Now the question is, who is involved in international finance? Number one, there are 4 institutions, those who are involved in this international financing. Number one is International Finance Corporation. Number 2, the World Bank. Number 3, the National Bureau of Economic Research. And the number 4, International Monetary Fund. They play pivotal roles in the mediation of the international finance. The World Bank, for example, provides finance and advice to assist middle and poor income countries, while the IMF provides advice, policy recommendations, and loans to its 189 member countries to promote economic stability in the world. If a country needs a precautionary loan to stop it from falling into an economic crisis, it would approach the IMF. In the private sector, the Institute of International Finance helps the international financial industry to manage risks prudently and advocates for the type of regulation that fosters global financial stability and sustainable economic growth. Members of the Institute include investment and commercial banks, insurance companies, and hedge funds. Now, this third question is, what does international finance mean for small businesses? If you have a branch in another country, then it's likely you will be conducting international finance. An example would be sending money from your US-based head office to your factory in an Indian city. Even though the money never changes hands, because you are transferring the money, whether it is head office or it is branch, you are remitting the money from US, any city of US to any city in India. The money never changes hands. It still belongs to the company. It did cross the borders, no doubt about it. So it's a form of international finance. Buying your raw materials abroad or selling your products abroad also requires an international financial transaction. In the form of buying and selling, exchange rates are a critical issue in this example. So now I will move to another topic, the modes of entry into foreign market, investment, and for business. These are 8 modes. People who think to expand their business opportunities, there is an option for them to enter into foreign market. Entry into a foreign country's market can be tricky, though as you adapt a new culture, new regulatory environment, and new competition, there are several ways to jump into a foreign market, some easier than others. So what are those 8 modes? The first is joint venture agreement. One of the most popular modes of entry is the establishment of a joint venture, in which 2 businesses combine resources to sell products or services. Many countries with tightly controlled economies, such as China, often require foreign companies to partner with a local company if they wish to sell products to their residents. Although joint ventures provide foreign companies with a partner experienced in the foreign market, these partnerships can be difficult to manage and require a splitting profit. Definitely, if you will make a partnership, your profit will be distributed. Same as is happening in any other partnership firms, whether it is within India or out of India also. Same system will apply. Now the second mode is licensing agreement. In the licensing mode of entry, companies sign contracts with foreign businesses called licensees that allow the foreign companies to legally manufacture and sell companies' products. The foreign companies will either purchase the license outright or pay a regular licensing fee or pay a percentage of their revenue over time in the form of royalties. Often used by manufacturing firms, licensing allows a company to enter a market quickly and inexpensively, but provides little control over the products, foreign marketing, and sales. The third mode is exporting directly. Rather than attempt to partner with or without a license to foreign companies, some companies will simply sell their products to distributors overseas, who will sell the products to consumers. Exporting means the company avoids having to invest the money in developing manufacturing facilities in the foreign market, but transportation costs and restrictive tariffs may make this mode uneconomical for certain products. But at present, this is very common mode of doing business abroad. Then number 4 is online sales. Many companies will attempt to enter foreign markets indirectly by targeting foreign consumers on the internet. Similar to exporting, companies retain their physical operations in their native countries but ship the products overseas. However, whereas in exporting, companies contract with local businesses, with the internet, they take orders directly from consumers. One advantage to this mode is that it is relatively cheap, entailing only the cost of website and marketing. The downside is that it is often less effective than establishing a physical presence in the foreign market. Consumers may be deterred due to shipping costs, duties, and taxes that may be levied by their government, and the length of time it takes for their orders to arrive. Number 5, purchasing foreign assets. Many companies, rather than launching an entirely new venture in a foreign market, will simply purchase or invest in a foreign company. They may buy their shares, if that is irrespective of the fact whether it is a public limited company or a partnership or a sole proprietorship. They may invest funds and contribute in their capital. So this is the way. While often more expensive, direct investment allows the investing company to reap the profits and a business that is already well integrated into the local market. If any company is already in existence, definitely if a newcomer joins them, he will get the benefit. He will have not to go for the startup period to start the new venture and then wait for the time to reap the profit. So it will be going there and just join their profits. Then number 6 is franchising your brand. The good thing about franchising is that it's one of the easier ways to break into new markets. All you have to do is to take your existing successful business models, find a franchisee in your targeted market, whatever country you want, build out the franchise and open your doors, just like many companies are doing in India. And especially in education sector, there are many companies for kids education, for higher education as well. The bad thing about franchising is that there is almost always a compromise. Then number 7th is turnkey solution or products. If someone is doing business in construction or engineering, this turnkey projects normally is turnkey term is used for the construction or engineering projects where someone has to build anything and deliver. So if someone is doing business in construction or engineering, it's worth trying to find turnkey projects in foreign countries to bid on. Turnkey is where you build something from the ground up, and whoever you turn the product over to just has to turn the key before he or she is ready to go. These are some of the best contracts to get because they almost always come from governments. Everyone knows that these are some of the best contracts to get, and they will often be competing with other foreign and domestic firms for the contract. Then the last one, number 8, is piggyback, not piggy bank, piggyback. The issue of piggybacking is an old and early form of strategic partnering. In particular, the piggybacking is discussed as a strategy to serve foreign markets, especially where the market has high entry barriers. Because many countries have different types of barriers. I will discuss in coming topics what are the trade barriers. So the main requirements for piggybacking are producing good quality products and finding business houses to export that products using their business names. Piggybacking is a viable alternative for firms with limited exporting activities, resources, and lack of knowledge of foreign market. There are many exporting companies who are not producing their entire export items. They are getting from some other manufacturers, and then they are labeling their own name and they are exporting it. So that is piggybacking. So now, as I discussed earlier, that barriers of trade, there are 3 barriers of trade. International trade is carried out by both businesses and government as long as no one puts up trade barriers. In general, trade barriers keep firms from selling to one another in foreign markets. The major obstacles to international trade are: number 1, natural barriers; number 2, tariff barriers; and number 3, non-tariff barriers. So what are natural barriers? Natural barriers to trade can be either physical or cultural. For instance, even though raising cattle in the relative warmth of Argentina may cost less than raising cattle in the bitter cold of Siberia, The cost of shipping the cattle from South America to Siberia might drive the price too high. Distance is thus one of the natural barriers to international trade. This is the example that if someone is exporting any goods from India to Sri Lanka, it will be cheaper as compared to exporting the goods from India to America. Language is another natural trade barrier. People who can't communicate effectively may not be able to negotiate trade agreements or may ship the wrong goods. Sometimes it's happened, though English is an international language for all trades, but still sometimes if you are dealing with some Arabian country, there may be a language barrier, or France or Spain, Spanish and French and English. So that may be a natural barrier. Then the second is tariff barriers. A tariff, as we all know, is a tax imposed by a nation on imported goods. It may be a charge per unit, such as per barrel of oil or per new car. These are in units. It may be a percentage of the value of the goods, such as 5% or more or less than that. No matter how it is assessed, any tariff makes imported goods more costly. So they are less able to compete with domestic products. Protective tariff make imported products less attractive to buyers than domestic products. Definitely, if the tariff is added in the cost of the goods, the product's cost will go high. The United States, for instance, has protective tariffs on imported poultry, textiles, sugar, and some types of steel and clothing. In March 2018, the Trump administration added tariffs on steel and aluminum from most countries. On the other side of the world, Japan imposes a tariff on US cigarettes that makes them cost more than Japanese brands. US tobacco firms believe they could get as much as a third of the Japanese market if there were no tariffs on cigarette. Then arguments in favor of tariffs. There are arguments in favor and against both. So what are the arguments in favor? The US Congress has debated the issue of tariffs since 1789. More than 200 years ago, they are debating this issue. The main arguments for tariffs include the following. Number one, tariffs protect infant industries. A tariff can give a struggling new domestic industry time to become an effective global industry and competitor. Number two, tariffs protect US jobs. Unions and others say tariffs keep foreign labor from taking away US jobs. Number third, tariffs aid in military preparedness. Tariffs should protect industries and technology during peacetime that are vital to the military in the event of war. Now, the main arguments against tariff, and these are following. Number one, tariff discourage free trade, and free trade lets the principle of competitive advantage work most efficiently. Number two, tariffs raise prices, thereby decreasing consumers' purchasing power. In 2017, the United States imposed tariffs from 63.86% to 190.71% on a wide variety of Chinese steel products. This is a very high percentage of increase from 63.86 to 190.76, means almost 120 or 121% more. Sorry, 128% more. The idea was to give US steel manufacturers a fair market after the Department of Commerce concluded their anti-dumping and anti-subsidy probes that resulted in upward pressures on prices in the United States. Based on 2019 import levels, US and retaliatory tariffs currently impact over $460 billion of imports and exports, and United States tariffs are increasing consumer costs by roughly $57 billion annually. The tariffs are having a notable impact on trade levels, decreasing both imports and exports, which reduces consumers' options and further increases prices in the United States. The third is non-tariff barriers. Government also use other tools besides tariffs to restrict trades. One type of non-tariff barriers is the import quota, or limits on the quantity of a certain goods that can be imported. The goals of setting quotas is to limit imports to the specific amount of a given product. The United States protects its shrinking textile industry with quotas. A complete ban against importing or exporting a product is an embargo. Often embargoes are set up for defense purposes. For instance, the United States does not allow various high-tech products such as supercomputers and lasers to be exported to countries that are not allies. Although this embargo costs US funds billions of dollars each year in lost sales, it keeps enemies away from using the latest technology in their military hardware. And probably this is the reason they supply the other developing countries the obsolete products which they have already redundant, they have already made redundant, and then they supply to the other developing nations. Then exchange controls are laws that require a company earning foreign exchange or foreign currency from the exports to sell the foreign exchange to a control agency, usually a central bank. By controlling the amount of foreign exchange sold to companies, the government controls the amount of products that can be imported. Limiting imports and encouraging exports helps a government to create a favorable balance of trade. Nowadays, you must have less listen in the TV news that there is a big balance of trade gap between India and China. So that if you are exporting goods, say $10 billion to some country and importing from there $50 million or $60 million, it means the gap between 50 to 10 or 60 to 10 is a gap. That gap is not healthy. Always there should be a balance of trade so that both the economies, both the countries could go forward, and that's why now this point also I will discuss afterwards. Now there are different types of international payment modes. So I have to discuss what are those modes and how they work. When it comes to trading of commercial goods, there is always a certain level of risk and trust involved. Whether you are a buyer or seller, you are bound to be exposed to some risk when dealing with international transactions. In large part, the amount of risk involved highly depends on the methods of payment you use. There are plenty of international paying methods for importers and exporters across the globe, and as the world continues to globalize, we are seeing an increase in international payment modes. But as with customers, the parties lying at the split ends of the spectrum have clashing agendas and priorities to fulfill and to look out for. If the purchase order is to be completed over a long period, say 6 months or 1 year or more, and the seller asks some advance payment, in that case, the buyer may ask them to provide a bank guarantee equivalent to the amount of the advance payment to be valid until the delivery of the material. Suppose you are an exporter and you want to supply some goods which you have received order, but you have not received any advance payment, you have not received any LC document, then what you can do, just to request the person who is purchasing from you or the country that to give me a bank guarantee to the extent of the amount you are going to buy from me. And this bank guarantee will be valid until such date the supplies are delivered to you. So the bank guarantee equivalent to the amount of the advance payment to be valid until the delivery of the material. This bank guarantee should be asked from a first-class bank. There are, especially in United States, there are many local banks, just like many cooperative banks in our country. So it's always better when you are dealing with international transaction, you should ask bank guarantee from an international bank, and that too from a first class international bank, because they are also graded, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, and so on. So the main international payment methods used around the world today include: number 1 is cash in advance. Number 2, letters of credit. Most reliable source is letters of credit. Then documentary collection, number 3. Then number 4, open account. Number 5, on consignment basis. So I'll see the first one, cash in advance. It's normally very seldom it happens that people give cash in advance. With cash in advance payment terms, an exporter can avoid credit risk because payment is received before the ownership of the goods is transferred. For international sales, wire transfers and credit cards are the most commonly used cash in advance options available to the exporters. With the advancement of the internet, escrow services are becoming another cash in advance option for small export transactions. However, requiring payment in advance is the least attractive option for the buyer because it creates unfavorable cash flow. Foreign buyers are also concerned that the goods may not be sent if payment is made in advance or may not be in the same quality. Thus, exporters who insist on this payment method as their sole manner of doing business may lose to competitors who offer more attractive payment terms. In some cases, where purchase is for a specific custom-built item, there may be an option to pay part amount in advance and the balance through letter of credit, that is LC. Then the second option, letters of credit. Letters of credit or LCs are one of the most secure instruments available to international traders. An LC is a commitment by a bank on behalf of the buyer that payment will be made to the exporter or supplier provided that the terms and conditions stated in the LC documents have been met as verified through the presentation of all required documents. LC is a document which states all the terms and conditions agreed between buyer and seller. What will be the size, quantity, or rate, and the terms of supplying, whether it will be shipped by sea or by air, whatever, all transport terms and conditions, all monetary payments system, whether it will be paid. There may be LC terms and conditions that some payment will be, as mentioned here, that some payments will be made in advance, some may be at the time of delivery, and some even after some period of delivery. Say, for example, 50% in advance or 30% in advance, then at the time of delivery 50%, then 30, 50, 80, balance 20% to be paid after 3 months or after 6 months of the delivery or after 1 month of the delivery. So all these terms and conditions, whatever have been agreed upon between seller and buyer, are mentioned in the LC documentation, and those LC documents are submitted to the bank, and based on that, both the banks of purchaser and seller works accordingly. So an LC is useful when reliable credit information about a foreign buyer is difficult to obtain. This is very important. Since we don't know any purchaser or purchaser don't know any seller, so it's very good way of contacting each other. But the exporter is satisfied with the credit worthiness of the buyer's foreign bank because they don't know each other, but both banks know each other. And LC also protects the buyer since no payment obligation arises until the goods have been shipped as promised. Number third is documentary collections. This is DC. A documentary collection is a transaction whereby the exporter entrusts the collection of the payment for a sale to its bank. That is called remitting bank, which sends the documents to the importer's bank, that is collecting bank, with the instructions to release the documents to the buyers for payment. Funds are received from the importer and remitted to the exporter through the bank involved in the collection in exchange for those documents. This documentary collection involves using a draft that requires the importer to pay the face amount either at side document against payment or on a specified date. Document against acceptance. The collection letter gives instructions that specify the documents required for the transfer of title to the goods. Although banks do act as facilitators for their clients, DCs offer no verification, process, and limited recourse in the event of non-payment. DCs are generally less expensive than LC because LC is little bit costly also, and also if it is a confirmed LC means more cost to the buyer. Then number 4 is open account. An open account transaction is a sale where the goods are shipped and delivered before payment is due, which in international sales is typically in 30, 60, or 90 days. Obviously, this is one of the most advantageous options to the importer in terms of cash flow and cost, but it is consequently one of the highest risk options for an exporter because of intense competition in export market. Foreign buyers often press exporters for open account terms, since the extension of credit by the seller to the buyer is more common abroad. Therefore, exporters who are reluctant to extend credit may lose a sale to their competitors. Exporters can offer competitive open account terms while substantially mitigating the risk of non-payment by using one or more of the appropriate trade finance techniques. When offering open account terms, the exporter can seek extra protection using export credit insurance. This export credit insurance is widely available in India. So if the exporters feels that they should need an insurance, they must take it. Then 5th is consignment. Consignment in international trade is a variation of open account in which payment is sent to the exporter only after the goods have been sold by the foreign distributor to the end customer. Probably all the students must have read in intermediate consignment accounts. So this is what I am telling. So an international consignment transaction is based on a contractual arrangement in which the foreign distributor receives, manages, and sells the goods for the exporter, who retains title to the goods until they are sold. Clearly, exporting or on consignment is very risky as the exporter is not guaranteed any payment and its goods are in a foreign country in the hands of an independent distributor or agent. Consignment helps exporters becomes more competitive on the basis of better availability and faster delivery of goods. Selling on consignment can also help exporter reduce the direct cost of storing and managing inventory. The key to success in exporting on consignment is to partner with a reputable and trustworthy foreign distributor or a third-party logistic provider. Appropriate insurance should be in place to cover consigned goods in transit or in possession of a foreign distributor, as well as to mitigate the risk of non-payment. That is very important. Now, fifth is international monetary system. How the international monetary system works, this is I'm going to tell you. International monetary system refers to a system that forms rules and standards for facilitating international trade among the nations. It helps in reallocating the capital and investment from one nation to another. It is the global network of the government and financial institutions that determine the exchange rate of different currencies for international trade. It is a governing body that sets rules and regulations by which different nations exchange currency with each other. With the growing complexity in the international trade and financial market, the international monetary system is necessary to assign a standard value of the international currencies. The rules and regulations set by the international monetary system to regulate and control the exchange value of the currencies are agreed upon by the respective governments of the nations. Thus, the government's stance may affect the decision making of the international monetary system. For example, change in the trade policy of a government may affect the international trade of goods and services. International monetary system motivates and encourages the nations to participate in the international trade to improve their balance of payment and minimize the trade deficit. It has grown over the years as a single architectural body of a vision to integrate the global economy. Some of the important achievements of the international monetary system over the years have been the establishment of World Bank and International Monetary Fund in the year 1944. The establishment of IMF and World Bank is the result of the agreement among nations to set a body, because this was agreed between all the member countries of the IMF and monetary system, International Monetary Fund, and the establishment of IMF and World Bank is the result of the agreement among nations to set a body which promotes and supports the international trade. Now let's discuss the evolution of international monetary system. Earlier in 1870 to 1914, 1914, trade was carried with the help of gold and silver without any institutional support. At that time, monetary system was decentralized and market-based and money played a minor role as compared to gold in international trade. The use of gold declined after World War I as war increased expenditure and inflation. In such a scenario, countries planned to revive the standard of gold but failed due to Great Depression. Thus, in 1944, 730 representatives of 44 nations met at Bretton Woods. Bretton Woods is a name of a city, New Hampshire, United States, to create a new international monetary system. This was called as the Bretton Woods system, which became a turning point in the history of international trade. The aim of new international monetary system is to create a stabilized international currency system and ensure a monetary stability for all the nations. It was decided that since the United States held most of the world's gold, thus all the nations would determine the values of their currencies in terms of dollar. The central banks of nations were given the task of maintaining fixed exchange rates with respect to dollar for each currency. The Bretton Woods system ended in 1971 as the trade deficit and growing inflation undermined the value of dollar in the whole world. In 1973, the floating exchange rate system, also known as flexible exchange rate system, was developed and was market based. Now, Bretton Woods. The Bretton Woods system was established, as I told you before also, established after World War II and was in existence during the period 1945-1972. In 1944, representatives of 44 nations, as mentioned earlier, met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and designed a new post-war international monetary system. This system advocated the adoption of an exchange standard that included both gold and foreign exchanges. Under this system, each country established a par value in relation to the US dollar, which was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce of gold. Under this system, the reserve currency country could aim to run a balance of payments deficit to supply reserves. If such deficits turned out to be very large, then the reserve currency itself would witness crisis. This condition was often coined the Tiffin paradox. Eventually, in the early 1970s, the gold exchange standard system collapsed because of these reasons. From 1950 onwards, the United States started facing trade deficit problems. With development of the euro market, there was a huge outflow of dollars. The US government took several dollar defense measures, including the imposition of the interest equalization tax, that is IET, on US purchases of foreign stock to prevent the outflow of dollars. The International Monetary Fund created a new reserve asset called special drawing right, that are SDRs, to ease the pressure on the dollar, which was the central reserve currency. Initially, the SDRs were modeled to be the weighted average of 16 currencies of such countries whose shares in the world exports were more than 1%. In 1981, the SDR were restructured to constitute only 5 major currencies, and those are the US dollar, German mark, Japanese yen, British pound, and French franc. The SDR were also being used as a denomination currency for international transactions, but the dollar-based gold exchange standard could not be sustained in the context of rising inflation and monetary expansion. So this was the Bretton Woods and the foreign currency system. Now, I will discuss about SDR or special drawing rights that discussed in the previous topic. So we'll explain in detail. Special drawing rights during the late 60s, the growth in the world resources did not keep pace with the growth in the international trade. During 1963 to 1968, the monetary reserves in the form of gold and US dollars increased by 16%, while for the same period, the growth in the international trade was 70%. The slackness in the growth of reserves was mainly due to the dependence on the accreditation of gold to monetary reserves, the need to increase the international liquidity, that is to say, resources for settlement of international debts, was felt, and after much thought on the subject, it resulted in the introduction of special drawing rights, that is SDR, in 1970. SDRs are entitlement granted to member countries, enabling them to draw from the IMF apart from their quotas. Every country has got a quota. How much million or billion SDRs they have, it depends upon their trade and their economy. The arrangement is similar to a bank granting credit limit to its customers. When SDRs are allocated, the country's special drawing account with the IMF is credited with the amount of the allotment. When the country experiences need for foreign exchange, it can sell SDRs to another country and get the foreign exchange. Thus, if India is in need of foreign exchange and UK agrees to meet this need to the extent of, say, SDR 100 million, the arrangement will be that India will inform IMF that it is selling SDR 100 million to UK. Then what IMF will do? IMF would debit this amount in India's special drawing rights account and credit the same amount to the account of UK. India would receive from UK either in British pound sterling or in any other currency as agreed between them. It may be any other country. It doesn't need to be in the same currency with which a country is dealing. So SDR is not a currency. This should be understood first, that SDR is not a currency. It is only an arrangement. So SDR is not a currency and has no backing of any security, nor is the IMF liable on the SDRs allocated. It is merely an asset created out of book entries. Every member participating in the SDR scheme is required to accept up to 200% of its allocation of the SDRs when offered by other countries and exchange with currency of its own or other currencies. Now, how the allocation is done? Allocation of SDR is made to the member countries in proportion to their quotas. The decision to allocate SDRs is taken periodically by the Board of Governors, taking into account the requirements of international liquidity. At the end of May 2020, the total amount of SDRs allocated stood at SDR 21.433 billion. So this is all about SDR. Now we'll move forward to another topic, the balance of payment. What is the balance of payment? Balance of payment is a statement which records all the monetary transactions made between residents of a country and the rest of the world during any given period. This statement includes all the transactions made by or to individuals, corporates, and the governments, and helps in monitoring the flow of funds to develop the economy. When all the elements are correctly included in the BOP or balance of payment, it should sum up to zero in a perfect scenario. This means the inflows and outflows of funds should balance out. However, this does not ideally happen in most of the cases. This is really difficult also. It doesn't mean that if we are exporting to some country, as I said in the beginning, that $100 billion, and they should also send us goods for $100 billion. No, it's not. Definitely there will be some balance of payment will be there, but to acceptable limits is okay, not very high difference. BOP statement of a country indicates whether the country has a surplus or a deficit of funds. That is, say, when a country's export is more than its import, its BOP is said to be in surplus. On the other hand, BOP deficit indicates that a country's imports are more than its exports. Tracking the transactions under BOP is something similar to the double entry system of accounting. This means all the transactions will have a debit entry and a corresponding credit entry. And now the question is, why balance of payment is vital for a country? There are some reasons, and those reasons are: number one, BOP of a country reveals its financial and economic status. Number two, BOP statement can be used as an indicator to determine whether the country's currency value is appreciating or depreciating. Number three, BOP statement helps the government to decide on fiscal and trade policies. Number four, it provides important information to analyze and understand the economic dealings of a country with other countries. By studying its BOP system and its components closely, one would be able to identify trends that may be beneficial or harmful to the economy of the country, and thus then take appropriate measures. Now, what are elements of balance of payment? There are three components of balance of payments, namely current account, second is capital account, and third is financial account. The total of the current account must balance with the total of capital and financial accounts in ideal situation. The current account is used to monitor the inflow and outflow of goods and services between countries. This account covers all the receipts and payments made with respect to raw material and manufactured goods. It also includes receipts from engineering, tourism, transportation, business services, stocks, and royalties from patents and copyrights. When all the goods and services are combined together, they make up to a country's balance of trade. There are various categories of trade and transfers which happen across countries. It could be visible or invisible trading, unilateral transfers or other payments or receipts. Trading in goods between countries are referred to as visible items, and import, export of services, including banking, information technology, etc., are referred to as invisible items. Unilateral transfers refer to money sent as gifts or donation to residents of foreign countries. This can also be personal transfers like money sent by relatives to their family located in another country. Then the second is capital account. All capital transactions between the countries are monitored through the capital account. Capital transactions include the purchase and sales of assets, that is non-financial, like land and properties. The capital account also includes the flow of taxes, purchase and sales of fixed assets, etc., by migrants having out or in to a different country. The deficit or surplus in the current account is managed through the finance from capital account and vice versa. There are three major elements of capital account. Number one is loans and borrowings. It includes all types of loans from both the private and public sectors located in foreign countries. Number two, investments. These are funds invested in the corporate stocks by non-residents. And the third one is foreign exchange reserves. Foreign exchange reserves held by the central bank of a country to monitor and control the exchange rate that does impact the capital account. Now, third is financial account. The flow of funds from and to foreign countries through various involvements in real estates, business ventures, foreign direct investment, etc., is monitored through the financial account. This account measures the changes in the foreign ownership of domestic assets and domestic ownership of foreign assets. On analyzing these changes, it can be understood if the country is selling or acquiring more assets like gold, stocks, equity, etc. There is an illustration. Say, for example, if for the year 2019, the value of exported goods from India is rupees 800 lakhs and the value of imported items to India is 900 lakhs, then India has a trade deficit of rupees 100 lakh for the year 2019. 900 minus 800 equal to 100. Then BOP statement acts as an economic indicator to identify the trade deficit or surplus situation of a country. analyzing and understanding the BOP of a country goes beyond just deducting the outflows of funds from inflows. As mentioned above, there are various components of BOP and illustrations in these documents which provide a clear indication about which sector of the economy needs to be developed. Now, 8 is foreign direct investment, that is FDI. Apart from being a critical driver of economic growth, foreign direct investment or FDI has been a major non-debt financial resource for the economic development of India. Foreign companies invest in India to take advantage of relatively lower wages, special investment privileges like tax exemptions, etc. For a country where foreign investment is being made, it also means achieving technical know-how and generating employment. The Indian government's favorable policy regime and robust business environment has ensured that foreign capital keeps flowing into the country. The government has taken many initiatives in recent years, such as relaxing FDI norms across sectors such as defense, PSU, that is public sector undertakings, oil refineries, telecom, power exchanges, and stock exchanges, among others. Then what should be the market size? According to the Department for Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade, DPIIT, Department for Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade, FDI equity inflow in India stood at $456.79 billion during April 2000 to December 2019. This is almost, you can say, 19 years period, indicating that relaxing FDI norms has yielded results. FDI equity inflow in India stood at $36.79 billion during April to December 19. Data for 2019-20 indicates that the service sector attracted the highest FDI equity inflow of $6.52 billion, followed by computers, software, and hardware at $6.34 billion, telecommunications sector at $4.29 billion, and trading at $3.52 billion. During 2019-20, India received the maximum FDI equity inflow from Singapore, that is $11.65 billion, followed by Mauritius, $7.45 billion, the Netherlands, $3.53 billion, Japan, $2.80 billion, and the USA, $2.79 billion. Now, there are some government's initiatives, and what are those initiatives that resulted in the FDI in India? So these are the government initiatives. Number one, in May 20, I'll go from recent to the past. In May 2020, government increased FDI in defense manufacturing under the automatic route from 49% to 74%. Number two, in April 2020, government amended existing consolidated FDI policy for restricting opportunistic takeovers or acquisition of Indian companies from neighboring nations. Number three, in March 2020, government permitted non-resident Indians, that is NRIs, to acquire up to 100% stake in Air India. Unfortunately, nobody came up. Number four, in December 2019, government permitted 26% FDI in digital sectors. Number five, in August 2019, government permitted 100% FDI under the automatic route in coal mining for open sale, as well as in developing allied infrastructure like washeries. Number six, in Union Budget 2019-20, the Government of India proposed opening FDI in aviation, media, that is animations and AVGC, and insurance sectors in consultation with all stakeholders. Number seven, 100% FDI is permitted in insurance intermediaries. Number eight, in February 2019, the Government of India released the draft National E-Commerce Policy to encourage FDI in the marketplace model of e-commerce. Further, it is stated that the FDI policy for e-commerce sector was developed to ensure a level playing field for all participants. Number nine, Government of India had been planning to consider 100% FDI in insurance intermediaries in India to give a boost to the sector and attract more funds. Number 10, in December 2018, the Government of India revised FDI rules related to e-commerce. As per the revised rules, 100% FDI was allowed in the marketplace-based model of e-commerce. Further, sales by any vendor through e-commerce marketplace entity or its group companies was limited to 25% of the total sale of such vendor. So this was the FDI. Now I'll move forward to another topic, types of foreign exchange or foreign currency exchange exposure. There are three types of foreign currency exposures. So foreign currency exchange exposure is classified into three types, namely transaction, translation, and economic exposures. Translation exchange exposure deals with actual foreign currency transaction. Then translation exposure deals with the accounting, representation, and economic exposure, deals with the little macro level exposures, which may be true for the whole industry rather than just the firm under section. Now, in detail, foreign exchange exposure is said to exist for a business or a firm when the value of its future cash flows is dependent on the value of foreign currency or currencies. If a British firm sells products to a US firm, cash inflow of British firm is exposed to foreign exchange, and in a case of the US based firm, cash outflow is exposed to foreign exchange. We are so skeptical about this exposure because it is the exchange rates tend to change or fluctuate. In the above situation, we saw how a firm directly involved in the foreign currency dealing is exposed to the risk of foreign exchange. It may be surprising to know that a firm with no such direct connection may also be found exposed to foreign currency risk. Just to share an example, if a company producing small electronics products in Sri Lanka is competing against the products imported from China. Now, if the price of China or the if the price of Chinese yuan per Indian rupee is decreased, there will be a decrease in cost advantage to the importer over that in Indian company. It is evident from the example that the firm having no direct access to foreign exchange can also be impacted. Commonly, the exposure is classified into three types of foreign currency exposure. And again, foreign currency exposure has also three types. Number one is transaction exchange exposure. The simplest kind of foreign currency exposure which anybody can easily think of is the transaction exposure. As the name itself suggests, this exposure pertains to the exposure due to an actual transaction taking place in business involving foreign currency. In a business, all monetary transactions are meant for profits as its end result. There are all the chances of that final objective getting hampered if it is a foreign currency transaction and the currency market moves forward the unfavorable direction. If you have bought goods from a foreign country and payables are in foreign currency to be paid after 3 months, then you may end up paying much higher on the due date as currency value may increase. This will increase your purchase price and therefore the overall costing of the product, compelling the profit percentage to go down or even convert to loss. Then translation exposure. The risk that a company's equities, assets, liabilities, or income will change in value as a result of exchange rate changes. This occurs when a firm denominates a portion of its equities, assets, liabilities, or income in a foreign currency, also known as accounting exposure. Considering a company has borrowed dollars to finance the import of capital goods worth $10,000 at the rate of rupees 73 per dollar. The entry was booked at this rate. The depreciation on the asset would be provided accordingly, assuming that the foreign exchange rate has not changed. But what happens? However, if at the time of finalization of the accounts, the exchange rate has moved to say rupees 78, it would involve translation loss of rupees 50,000. Why? Because the entry was booked at the rate of $73 and when the time of payment came, it was paid at the rate of 78. So the difference was 5 rupees per dollar and the amount was $10,000. So it was the $50,000 that the loss was. However, this loss cannot be written off and has to be capitalized by increasing the book value of the fixed assets purchased. This is what we are doing when we are importing the heavy equipment from foreign countries, and when we negotiated the exchange rate, especially if we talk about Saudi Arabia, dollar rate is fixed at the rate of 3.75 reals per dollar, but euro and British pounds are fluctuating. So if the or any other country's currency, so what we are doing, we book the entry, but at the time of final transaction, whatever we have paid, we book the amount based on the final payment, so that the currency exchange loss will not be recorded. It will be cost of the asset. So value of the fixed asset purchase will be debited by all the amount, whatever the conversion rate has been paid. Thus, the book value of the asset will become rupees 780,000, and consequently higher depreciation would be provided, reducing the net profit. If you have time, I can take up the another topic, sir. Should I move for another topic? Anyway. Okay, now I will move to a new topic, that is international economic institutions. There are four major international economic institutions. Nowadays, exports and imports from one country to another are increasing abundantly. The growth of international trade can be increased if the countries follow a common set of rules, regulations, and standards related to import and export. These common rules and regulations are set by various international economics institutions. These institutions aim to provide a level playing field for all the countries and develop economic cooperation. These institutions also help in solving the currency issues among countries related to stabilizing the exchange rates. These are three major international economic institutions, namely WTO, that is World Trade Organization. Second is IMF, that is International Monetary Fund. And the third is UNCTAD, that is United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. So the World Trade Organization was formed in 1995 to replace the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, that is GATT, G-A-T-T. Before the formation of WTO, this GATT was in place, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was started in 1948. And it was replaced by WTO because GATT was biased in favor of developed countries. WTO was formed as a global international organization dealing with the rules of international trade among the countries. There are three main objectives of the WTO, which are: number one, raising the standard of living of people, promoting full employment, expanding production and trade, and utilizing the world's resources optimally. Number two, ensuring that developing and less developed countries have better share of growth in the world trade. Third, introducing sustainable development in which balanced growth of trade and environment goes together. Then the main functions of WTO are as under. Number one, okay, I have been advised to wind up, so I'll thank everyone for sparing time and bearing with me. Thank you, everyone, and wish you everyone a very nice evening. Jai Hind. I'm I'm sorry that I could not complete this topic. Anyways, all the students will get all this presentation through email that way, Professor Resmi will share with you all. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir.
My pleasure. You are welcome. It was in, I hope you and all the students would have enjoyed this presentation and this time.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Moving to Ansi Sam. Ansi Sam for the vote of thanks.
Okay, a warm greeting to you all. Myself, Ansi Sam, faculty of Brazilius College. I deem it a great honor to propose the vote of thanks on behalf of organizing committee to all who have helped us in making this webinar such a resounding success. First of all, I would like to thank our resource person, Mr. Javed Ali, Chief Internal Auditor. Within a short span of time, sir gave us an insight on almost all the important aspects of the topic for making the session with excellent presentation with practical knowledge as well as experience knowledge got with some current affairs. And I'm sure almost all the participants get great benefit from this section, especially the postgraduate students. So on behalf of Basilius College, I express heartfelt thanks for you, your valuable time, and I extend yours. Thank you, sir, for such a great learning. Thank you,
Thanks
sir.
a lot. And it's my pleasure to be a resource person for your college students.
Okay. Next, I would like to express our profound gratitude to our principal, Dr. Biju Thomas, and also IPC coordinator, Dr. Shaju sir. And I extend my sincere thanks to our beloved head of the department, Manoj sir, for his moral support and guidance. And the special thanks to all my colleagues, especially Rashminis and Japatin sir. They are the coordinator, of course, making this webinar a grand success. Along with them, I thank the student coordinator, Agil and Kevin, who have been running around doing a lot of things for the success of the webinar. Finally, the wonderful participants who have turned up in great number, around 115 to 120 from various parts of our state. I am very glad and thankful to all the participants for their valuable presence and support, which is highly appreciated. Thank you all. Hoping the same response from your side for future. Before you leave the meeting, please check the chat box. In that, we are sure the feedback link. Please fill it. Then you will get certificates and feedback. Also essential for us for our further programs. So once again, I thank you all for your cordial cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you too, and please convey my best regards to the principal and everyone to whom I'm not able to see.
Thank you, Nancy. Sir, we have a question in the chat box which I missed. That is a question from Sadesh Chandranas. His question is like this: with the current situation with India and China, affect India's international finance. He is asking about the current situation of India and China. Will it affect the India's international finance with other countries? What is your opinion? He's asking your opinion.
Yes. Actually, at present, there is a wide gap between India and China trade relations. This is almost 25% to 75 or 80%, like that. So this is a very big trade gap, and probably this is a high time when there are tensions on the borders of both the countries, that the India must reconsider the balance of trade policy. And there are many traders, many business houses, they are saying that it will not be easy for us because they have already invested money in the product they have purchased. So they cannot dump it unless they are reimbursed for that cost. That is not easy. So that trade relations will continue, but the balance of trade has to be monitored. This is a major issue of this time and is the need of the hour. We must restrict the balance of trade and control that. That is the best thing. And you know, there is a saying, you cannot change neighbors. You cannot, you have to do the business with them. And this is for the best growth of both the countries, but in a balanced manner. So this is my own opinion, and I think that it will be the opinion of the most of the people that we cannot close the trade relations. No, we have to continue trade relations, but in a limited capacity so as to maintain the balance of trade. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Okay, there are no more questions in the chat box. Okay, I find this time, the time is running out, so we are about to end the session. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us. Participants, please stay back for filling the forms and all. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure to be here, and thanks to Professor Resmi who contacted me, who made this event possible. It was a big effort she did. Okay, all the best to everyone. I'm now signing off.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you.
Welcome. Okay, bye.